Alright, so I've got the epoxy resin all mixed up according to the manufacturer's directions. I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do this kind of up close on doing the pour and kind of the getting it over the edges and on the sides and things like that. In the background here you see I've got my heat gun. I have a flashlight here to help put some extra light on it so I can see if there's any bubbles. So I've got it mixed up. There's a lot of bubbles in it right now. That's okay. I'm just going to pour some in the center. Yeah, probably about 2 inches, maybe a little bit more. One of the tips that I might recommend, or I recommend, is to make more epoxy mix than you think you will need. Because the last thing you want to do is run out of epoxy, and because this stuff cures kind of hard, somewhat quickly, of a few minutes, the amount of time it would make you to make another batch, it may not be able to pour it on here in time so that it all looks uniform. So always try to make a little bit more than you think you'll need, and then you should be safe. So what you see I'm doing now is just taking my popsicle stick stirrer. I have the big fat broad ones. I find it's a little easier to work as a spread paddle, as you can see that I'm doing as well, than the skinnier, thinner popsicle sticks. And what I'm doing is I'm dragging the epoxy that I did pour as far over and as close to the edges as possible. Okay, it's okay if it does spill over the edge a little bit. You actually want some of that, because I'll show you here. I'm going to take some of that stuff that spills over, and I call it painting the sides. That way it gets a nice, at least a thin layer of epoxy on the sides of the tile to help seal everything together. So you see I brought it to the edge there. Now I'm just taking the side of the epoxy stick, or excuse me, the popsicle stick, and kind of smoothing everything over, smearing it on the sides there. If you get drips kind of forming underneath, what I will do is I'll take kind of the blade edge of it and kind of scrape it off like this. And then you'll have some epoxy there, then you can kind of smooth the sides back down a little bit more. It's going to drip off, that's fine, don't worry about it. The epoxy is self-leveling as well. It'll form a natural edge at the edges here. And so it won't look like it runs over, it'll all be smooth. So as you're spreading this out, bringing it to the edges, you may need to add more epoxy to it, which is perfectly fine. That's why you have extra. Here you can see it looks like I might not have enough, so I'm going to add a little bit more. And that makes it, instead of trying to squeeze or spread out as much as possible, that you have, making it kind of thin in the middle there, just add a little bit more and then distribute it evenly as best you can. Okay? Just get it to the edges as well as you can, because if you're going to use a heat gun as your heat source to pop the bubbles, which is the next step, you can actually use the heat gun as a sort of a spreader for you as well, and help move some of the epoxy around. So it's kind of a 2-for-1 there. You'll be popping bubbles, but also you will be able to help move some of the epoxy to the different areas that you might need. So again, I'm kind of just scraping the drips that may be forming underneath. You might see that big old blob there, scraping that up. And you have masking tape or tape underneath the tile, hopefully, as I've shown in a previous video on prepping the tiles. So I will just scrape off as much as possible to make it as easy so you don't have these massive drips underneath hanging off of the bottom of your tile there. So just kind of scrape that away, I feel comfortable now that I'm at a point where I can scrape this away and then get ready to use the heat gun. I do have a little bit leftover epoxy, which is perfect. I get my light source, add some light there. That way I can see all the little bubbles that are in there. Add my heat gun. I typically start off with low heat. Heat guns are pretty hot, even at low heat. Supposedly this is several hundred degrees in temperature. And so I'm just going to use that to pop these bubbles here. Maybe move some, if I see that it didn't quite make it to the edge there, use the heat gun to kind of blow it to the edge or the corners. Initially we want to get it to the corner tips because it tends to pull back from the corner, leaving an epoxy like an uncovered edge. Basically, it doesn't look even when it's dry. So I like to make sure there's a little bit of extra on the edges here. Make sure the edges are fully covered. Turn the heat gun back on, pop these bubbles. Now don't leave the heat gun in one spot. Always move it around. Always move it around. That way you're not blowing heat in one concentrated area, making like a hole in the epoxy resin. So I'm gonna turn it to high. It gets even hotter. But because the fan kicks up as well, I'm actually going to hold it away a little bit further and move it a little bit faster than I was previously. So, because I don't want it to move the epoxy around too much. A lot of times I'll move it, you can see me doing it right now, in circular motions. That way I'm not, if I don't want to blow it around or blow it towards one direction in particular, I will spin in circular motions here with the heat gun to kind of keep the heat evenly distributed. Yeah, looking good so far. Okay, turn this off for a minute. Take a closer look here, see how we're doing. If I notice any bubbles that I might have missed, if I see any gaps like it's pulling back from the edges or the corners where I don't see full coverage of the epoxy, look at the edges to see that the epoxy that's dripped over, that you've smoothed it over the edge so it's a nice smooth edge. What else? Excessive drips underneath the edges of the tile. Again, take your popsicle stick or whatever you're using for a stir. It could be a plastic card, like an old gift card, works well as well. I've used plastic knives, plastic silverware knives. Basically, what you need is a kind of a flat surface that you can use to kind of do exactly what I'm doing, spread out the epoxy, but also use it to cut off, if you will, any kinds of drips and the like. So move this out of the way. Just double checking again, making sure I have full coverage all the way to the tips or the corners there. That my sides of the tile are painted with some epoxy. Give it a nice thin coat there. Helps make it look nice and even. Kind of seal everything in together. And like I said, it's nice to have the extra epoxy in case you need it. Because if you do, say for example, say you find a piece of dust right in the middle there. And so what you're gonna have to do is you have to take your stick or whatever you're using and kind of dig it out. Well, you may dump a bunch of epoxy off the side. And so you're gonna need to basically fill that gap again by pouring more epoxy back and then getting those bubbles out. Okay, so I'm looking, I am not seeing any other bubbles. So I should be good to go there. All right, so I'm happy with that. Everything looks good. So what I'm gonna do next is get a box or something. You can leave it like this and you just basically wanna let it dry, or but that's assuming you're in a dust-free area. What you don't want to have happen is you're in a dusty area and dust settles on your clear epoxy, and now you're going to see all that dust when it hardens, and there's no way to get that stuff out. So what I like to do is I will take a box and cover it up. So that's what I'm going to do here. Move this back. Got my big old box here, and carefully place the box. And that is that. Just gotta let it dry up and check it the next day.